Our invited speaker is Zohar Eviatar. She's a full professor of psychology at the psychology department at the University of Haifa. She's also a member of the Institute for Information Processing and Decision Making. Her research has ranged around the relationship between language abilities, such as reading in different languages, and multilingualism and the brain. She received her PhD from UCLA under the supervision of Eran Zaidel, where she began exploring reading abilities in the split brain. She has been a faculty member at the University of Haifa since 1994 and has retired this year. So thank you, Zohar, and I will let you the floor to start your talk.
Okay, thank you. I just want to say that I tend sometimes to speak quickly. So if I'm going too quickly, please don't hesitate to say something and then I can slow down. Okay? I really ask that because I tend to speak too fast. So today I'm going to talk to you about actually mind and flesh, about how we connect linguistic knowledge to neurons. So the gap we want to bridge is between this.
The first time I saw her, everything in my head went quiet. All the tics, all the constantly refreshing images just disappeared. When you have obsessive compulsive disorder, you don't really get quiet moments. Even in bed, I'm thinking that what the reaction.
And this, that's what we're trying to connect. Okay, so the language used, for example, in this great slam poetry and brain cells. So in the middle, between these two, we have these kinds of models. This is the famous model by Hickok and Popel from 2007, where they break down the linguistic abilities and localize them in brain networks. So what we see here is we have combinatorial networks and lexical interface. This, by the way, this is the left hemisphere. Do you see my mouse? Do you see my mouse? Okay. This is the left hemisphere and this is the right hemisphere. And the pink areas are related to combinatorial networks and to lexical interface. We have the green, which is this area. The green here is the primary auditory area where information comes to from the ears, and it's related to the phonological network, which is the yellow region here. And then we have the blue regions, which are articulatory networks and sensory motor interface, which in general are only in the left hemisphere because the left hemisphere is the one that talks. Okay, so we have these kinds of models. But so how can we model cognition in a way that bridges the behavior-brain gap? And in the 20th century, most of the 20th century was taken up by models of where we have abstract representations inside our head, and these are fed by input from the world and the output that we work upon the world, where the representations of the world are abstract and in the brain, versus embodied cognition, in which what we get from the brain and from the world and how we work on the world is all connected, and that is the way that things are encoded or represented in the brain via modality-specific information. We'll talk about that more. And there is now an emerging consensus for hybrid models that espouse embodiment, but also include some form of abstract representation. So it's really about how do we think about what we know about the world. And in linguistics, we have this model wasn't presented as such, but there's a very well-known linguistic model of embodiment, which is the motor theory of speech perception. The idea that we recognize speech sounds by recognizing how we ourselves produce them. So we have primary auditory analysis of the speech sound, and then we simulate the production of that speech sound, and that simulation is the result of that simulation is recognition of the speech sound. So the idea is that the fundamental hypothesis of embodiment is that simulation of an action potential is the mechanism by which information becomes encoded in the brain, in action perception. So knowledge is based on our experiences in the world, And conceptual representations are embodied in the sense that they are constituted by reactivation of the brain mechanisms that were activated during experience. So if we think about the concept of a dog, for example, it reactivates all the experiences that we've had with a dog. For different people, it may be different. For me, for example, the concept of a dog includes the smell of a wet dog. For another person, it may not. So again, this is the way that we think about cognition, which includes how we act and what we get from the world. So knowledge is reactivation of modality-specific information, and thinking about or remembering a concept involves a simulation of our interaction with the concept in the past. And this is a way of bridging the gap between our subjective experience of mind and the brain. In the 21st century, imaging studies have allowed new ways of exploring psycholinguistics. So a large number of studies have shown correlations of brain activity with the referential meanings of words. So these are different areas of the brain that are activated. So for example, for the word lick, we see activation of regions that are related to the face and the mouth. For when people read the word pick, we see an activation of the motor and sensory areas of the arm and the hand. And for kick, we see the activation for the word of the leg and the foot regions. And the idea is that knowledge is represented in a modal system that represents an action perception, something that we do in the world or something that we perceive from the world. However, we all know that language includes much more than words, right? Specifically, language is often defined by structure irregularities like word order, hierarchies, dependencies, and we know that that's part of the knowledge that we have when we know a language. When we know a language, we also know its structure. And so models based on semantic category simulation circuits can't be applied to explain how the knowledge of the structural regularities of language is embodied. How can that be embodied? We don't have an action perception to comprehend what a noun phrase is, but we know what a noun phrase is when we know a language. In 2014, Hamutal Kreiner and I suggested that the missing link in the embodiment of the structural aspects of language is prosody. This was the paper that we published in Brain and Language. It was the first paper I ever published that had no data in it. It was completely theoretical. And we suggested that prosody, the rhythmic and melodic aspect of spoken language, is the perceived physical event most closely associated with syntax, okay? Prosodic features such as stress, pitch, and rhythm organize the acoustic stream within temporal structures that distinguish between grammatical categories and groups of words and phrases into a hierarchical structure. So these are acoustic or physical characteristics of the language that we're hearing. So we posit that brain activity that resonates to these acoustic features of prosody underpins the embodiment of syntax. That's what we suggested in that paper. And we propose that the way to get to mind from flesh is via the way prosody is processed during language perception, both hearing and reading, we'll talk about that, and in language production. Prosody is the action perception that underlies the simulation of language form. So if embodied cognition is the simulation of an action perception with language, that action perception is prosody, is the prosody of the language. And there are models, these are models that have been proposed by Popel and his colleagues for many years of neural oscillations. The neurons fire together, and different rhythms of neural oscillations can be phase locked to generate hierarchic organization of temporal windows. So we can see here, we have a sentence. Sometimes the players play in festivities it's too small for me, to enliven the atmosphere, okay? And what we see is that the neural oscillations can be related to the different phrases in the sentence. So what we have are temporal patterns of speech. The sound wave has certain acoustic characteristics. It has rhythmic characteristics. And what we see, and this is what happens in the world, this is the physical aspect of the stimulus in the world. And what we see is that inside the brain, the neurons respond to the same kind of rhythm, to the same kind of temporal patterns. So we have temporal patterns in the sound wave, and we have temporal patterns in the neuronal spiking. So the underlying hypothesis is that the prosody of speech is the action perception that is simulated, and that translates linguistic information into brain language. And we suggested that this can constitute the missing link between abstract representation of structural regularities of language and brain activity. So the fundamental assumption of this hypothesis, is that the action perception that is simulated in language comprehension is the prosodic structure of the utterance that is being perceived, and that this simulation is done via inner speech. This is how we connect to inner speech. We hypothesize that inner speech is an embodiment of language form. Hearing our own voice or the voice of others in our head can have different manifestations. It can be monologic, where you can be narrating your experiences to yourself, or it can be dialogic, where you're having a conversation with different parts of yourself, or having a conversation with each other. Now, there's a continuum in the form of inner speech. So it can go from abstract mind wandering, where you're remembering conversations, or having, if verbal thought, you're having sentences come into your mind, versus phonological repetition, for example, when you're trying to remember a phone number and you're repeating the phone number in the phonological loop until you get to a piece of paper or enter it into your phone. We know that inner speech is related to memory and to emotional regulation, to self-motivation, to soothing and calming. Vygotsky suggested that the inner dialogue develops from overt dialogue, which occurs with caregivers and is then taken over by the child as private speech, which is then internalized. So there are many, many models of inner speech right now, and it has to do with how inner speech is related to our thinking processes, okay? And the phonological loop is one of the components of working memory, which is closely related to consciousness. So if you ask people who work on working memory, and you ask them, what is the content of working memory? They say, whatever is in consciousness at the time. And if you go to people who work on consciousness, and you ask them, what are the contents of consciousness? They say, oh, it's whatever is in working memory at the time. So the relationship between working memory and consciousness is very close and needs to be thought about more. We have data in both Hebrew and Arabic that suggests that children admit that they hear voices in their head after they have learned to read. So one of the things that we know that there are many, many implications or consequences of becoming literate. But another important consequence of becoming literate is becoming aware that there are voices in your head, because when you are reading silently, you are hearing words in your head, and you become aware of this. So to support our hypothesis, we need to examine whether prosody is preserved or generated in inner speech. And we've begun a series of studies to test the hypothesis that prosody of inner speech is the way that linguistic structure is translated into brain language. Our studies are preliminary and exploratory. because to our knowledge, we don't know that anybody has ever asked these questions before in this way. So many of the things that it is preliminary, it is exploratory. I'll be happy to talk about the theoretical implications of them with you guys afterwards. So I'm going to tell you about two of our studies. One has to do with how implicit prosody, that is prosody that from silent reading, is crucial to the processing of morphosyntax. And the other one looks at whether we can see the effects of prosody of inner speech on motor movements of the hands during typing. So the first one has to do with the contribution of prosodic simulation to comprehension of morphosyntax. And this was the MA thesis of Ori Sarfati, who looks like this. And it was done, I supervised him together with Hamutal Kreiner. And in this experiment, participants silently read sentences, some of which had grammatical errors. The grammatical errors we were interested in were number and gender agreement or disagreement. And the task was to decide if the sentence was correct or included an error. Is there a grammatical error in the sentence? We assume, after Janet Fodor, that readers project implicit prosody when they read silently, and that this implicit prosody is the basis upon which they compute morphosyntactic relations. And we also tested whether this representation is dependent on working memory. So the design of the experiment was the following. We had three independent factors, three things that we manipulated. The first one was prosody. So people either read things in their normal congruent prosody or in incongruent prosody, which was in triplets, which I'll show you in a minute how we operationalized. The second had to do with grammar. So some of the sentences were correct. They were correct grammatically, and some of them had either number agreement errors or gender agreement errors. We also had other kinds of errors just so that participants wouldn't, we had filler sentences with other kinds of errors so participants wouldn't be looking for those kinds of errors. And distance. So in half the sentences, the verb and the noun that are supposed to agree were close to each other, were right next to each other. And in the FAR conditions, there were 7 to 10 words intervening between the verb and the noun that had to match. And our dependent factor was D prime. It was sensitivity to grammar. How well can people distinguish between grammatical and ungrammatical sentences in each of the conditions? It's a measure of accuracy. How sensitive are they to grammaticality? So here are the examples. So for example, we have this is a natural congruent grammatical sentence. The instructor from the dance club of the famous art school tells me that the girls represent the school in an international dance competition. Whereas the ungrammatical version of the sentence was, the instructor from the dance club of the famous art school tells me that the girls represents in the school in an international dance competition. That's the normal congruent prosody. The triplets, in the triplets condition, there was a comma in every 3 words. So you read, the instructor from the dance club of the famous art school tells me that the girls represent the school in an international dance competition. Okay? And that's in the close condition where the girls and the verb, the noun and the verb are close to each other. In the FAR condition, it was the same, only the instructor tells me that the girls from the dance club of the famous art school represent the school. So here there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 words between the noun and the verb that have to match. Okay, and again we had grammatical and ungrammatical and natural congruent prosody or our triplet prosody. The instructor tells me that the girls. The girls from the dance club of the famous art and so on. And participants were trained to read this way. Now, every once in a while, there would be in the triplet condition, they would see a sentence. It was a filler sentence. It wasn't one that we counted, where they would have to read it aloud so that we could tell that they were really doing it in triplets, that they were really screwing up their prosody. Okay, so here are the results. What we have is we have the gender errors and the number errors. And in the natural, so D prime is a measure of accuracy. So the higher it is, the better performance is, okay? And you can see that for gender, they were much better at telling apart grammatical versus ungrammatical sentences in the natural prosody condition than in the triplet condition. Okay, but in the close condition, when the noun and the verb were close to each other, there was no difference. This was not significantly different. And we see the same pattern for number errors and essentially even stronger, excuse me, for number, where in the far condition, they're much better in the natural prosody than in the triplet condition, whereas in the close condition, there was no difference between their ability to tell grammatical from ungrammatical sentences in the natural and the triplet prosody. So unnatural prosody resulted in lower sensitivity for grammatical errors, but only when the noun and verb were far from each other. That is, prosody affected grammatical sensitivity when verbal memory was necessary to compute grammaticality. Only when verbal memory was necessary to compute grammaticality. When you didn't need memory, when the words were right next to each other, the prosody had no effect. So, and we're also now running 2 experiments with the same type of prosodic manipulation to examine the perception of irony and of emotion. And the one for emotion has been, just got finished, and I can tell you that the results are that people can tell the intensity of the emotion and the valence of the emotion much better, significantly better in the natural prosody than in the triplet prosody. So incongruent prosody also screws up how people can perceive the emotion that is in an utterance. So the second experiment that I'm going to tell you about was part of the PhD thesis of Yael Markussen. Again, I supervised her together with Hamutal Kreiner. And here we looked for simulations of prosody in motor systems. First of all, in the hands, we looked at the temporal characteristics of typing and surface EMG measures of articulatory muscles during listening and silent repetition. And I'll show you exactly what I mean by that. So we had 40 participants, and the procedure was this way. They listened to a sentence. They heard a sentence spoken by an actress. They repeated the sentence silently to themselves, and then they typed the sentence. And our dependent measures were for the hands. We looked at the relation between acoustic changes in the spoken sentence, the prosody of the spoken sentence, and measures of typing, timing, and pressure intensity in the hands. And we also looked at articulation, where we looked at SEMG changes in different muscles around the mouth. And this was a setup, okay? So they listened, they said it to themselves, and then they typed. Today, I'm going to tell you the results of the typing experiments, because the SEMG results are complex, and we won't have time to do them justice. And also, we need to think about them a little bit more deeply before I present them to the world. So what we had is, remember, 3 epochs. There was listening to a sentence, which had a certain kind of acoustic characteristics, and a certain type. Then there was an epoch of inner speech, and then we had a third epoch of typing. And what we measured is the relationship. What we examined was the relationship between the acoustic characteristics of the stimulus sentence and the motor measures of typing. And our motor measures of typing were interkey interval, that is the average time between key presses for each word. So it's the average, so that means it was normalized over word length. So word length couldn't affect this measure. And pressure. So the keyboard sat on a very sensitive scale that measured the degree of pressure of the key presses. We used the average pressure normalized for word length. Okay, again, the average pressure for words. Now, the stimuli that we used, we had 2 prosodic conditions. We had lexical prosody, so it was question versus statement. And we had emotional prosody. We had emotional versus neutral sentences. We also had two pragmatic conditions, which were direct and indirect speech. So, for example, mom asked Donna, what would you like to eat, in the direct condition, and in the indirect speech, it was mom asked Donna what she would like to eat. Okay, and this manipulation was done because direct speech may be more amenable to simulation than indirect speech, and we wanted to see if that happened. So these are the questions. Mom asked Donna, what would you like to eat? Or a statement, Mama told Donna at dinner, eat all your vegetables. Okay, and there was a direct and indirect condition for this. In the emotional and neutral experiment, we had, again, direct and indirect speech. So the teacher yelled at the students, everybody be quiet, versus the teacher yelled at the students to be quiet. So there was negative, there was neutral, and there was positive. Okay, so we're going to look at these separately. So for question versus statement, what we have is the following. So the red line is the acoustic measure. This is the mean duration of each word. There were 8 words in all of the sentences, and this is the duration of the word. Okay, so this is how this is in milliseconds, and this is how the duration of the word changes across the sentence. The blue line is the interkey interval, which is the typing tempo. Okay, so we have that for questions and we have that for statements. Is that clear? Okay, so for the statistics, what we did is we're predicting the interkey interval, the blue line, from the acoustic measure and the types of the word number and the speech manner. Okay, so we're trying to predict the blue line from the red line. We're trying to predict typing tempo from the acoustic characteristics of the spoken sentence. And what we found was this. First of all, there was an effective duration. You can see that word number was not significant, and neither was an effective whether it was direct or indirect. You can see that in the graphs too. The direct and indirect conditions really are on top of each other. But what was important to us is there was a duration by word number interaction. That is, the way in which the duration changes across the 8 words of the sentences predicted the way that the typing tempo changed across the duration of the sentence, across the 8 words of the sentence. Okay, so what it means is that word duration, the acoustic measure, predicts typing tempo as both of them change across the utterance. Okay, are there any questions about this? Is it clear? Okay, okay. When we looked at emotional prosody, again, what we have is we have our red line is the acoustic measure, and the blue line is the typing tempo. And what we have is, yes, Peter?
Are your subjects matched for typing ability?
Yeah, they're all students and they were all good typers. Yeah. Yeah. You don't get undergraduates who can't type anymore, at least in psychology. And these were psychology, first years, like everybody else, they were all the experiments in psychology, they're first year psychology students. Okay, so what we have is, again, we have the blue line is the typing tempo, that's the interkey interval, and the red line is the duration of the words that were spoken by the actress who said the sentence. And why aren't you moving? Just a sec. Okay. Again, what we're going to do in our statistics is to predict the interkey interval. We're going to predict the typing tempo measure from the acoustic measure. And what we did is we compared negative to neutral and separately positive to neutral. And let's look at the positive to neutral first. And what we see is that there was an effective duration overall, but not of word number. And most importantly, there was a duration by word number interaction. That is, as the duration changed across the sentence, it predicted the way that the typing tempo would change. What's interesting is you can see that there's no effect of type. That is, the neutral and the positive, if you look at it, are very similar. The patterns are both the patterns of the duration and the patterns of the thing. So there's no difference between neutral and positive, but in both of them, we can predict the typing measure from the acoustic measure. When we compare the negative to the neutral, what we see is that we do have an effect of type, because you can see that the pattern for negative prosody is different from the pattern from neutral prosody. And most importantly for us, again, we have the duration by word number interaction, where the way that duration changed across the sentence predicted the way that typing changed across the sentence. The typing tempo changed across the sentence. So both emotionally negative and positive spoken prosody predicted the timing of typing. Pitch is another measure of emotional prosody. We measured the pressure intensity of the key presses. Remember that the keyboard was on a very precise scale, and explored the relationship between pitch of the spoken sentences and pressure intensity of key presses. We did that for the emotional sentences. And what we have is this, is we have the pitch is in the purple line, and this is how it changed across the 8 words of the sentence. And the green is the typing measure. That's the pressure of the key presses, the average pressure for each word across the 8 words. And what we get is when we compare positive versus neutral, so we're comparing this pattern to this pattern, what we see is there's an effect, pitch changes. And we see that there was an effect in the pitch measure. There was a significant effect of speech manner, the pragmatic measure. So the direct versus the direct had much higher pitch than the indirect, okay, and higher pressure. Here's the difference in the acoustics. This is the difference in the pressure. And so our pragmatic measure, or our pragmatic manipulation of direct versus indirect speech, did have an effect on pitch measures. And most importantly, we have the word number by pitch. So as the acoustic measure changed across the 8 words, across the utterance, that affected the way, or that was correlated with the way that the intensity of pressure on the keys changed across the words. And this was true for both positive and neutral, and negative versus neutral. Again, we have the pitch by word number interaction. Okay, word number doesn't have an effect. Speech manner does have an effect. And here the type was also different. In pitch, positive also differed from neutral, and negative different from neutral. But most importantly for us is the changes across the sentence were predicted. The changes in pressure were predicted by the acoustic measure of the sentence. So changes in pitch related to emotional prosody predicted pressure intensity of the key presses. So to summarize the typing results, we show that 2 acoustic characteristics of heard speech, these are sentences that they heard, characteristics that are related to speech prosody, predict 2 measures of motor functions in the hands during typing. Now remember, there were 3 epochs, so they heard the sentence, then they had to repeat it silently, and then they typed. So these things didn't happen one right after the other. There was a little bit of a pause between the hearing and the typing. The relationships that we found make sense, because acoustic word duration predicted the timing of the key presses, whereas acoustic pitch predicted the intensity of the key presses. So our results speak to the debate in cognitive science about the manner in which linguistic information is represented in the mind-brain.
The first time I saw her, everything in my head went quiet. All the tics, all the constantly refreshing images just disappeared. When you have obsessive compulsive disorder, you don't really get quiet moments. Even in bed, I'm thinking that when I saw her, the only thing I could think about was the hairpin images just disappeared.
I love him. So we're connecting how this happens in this. So our general conclusions are the following. The associations between prosodic characteristics, whether they are implicit, as in the syntax study, because they read the sentences silently, they generated the prosody themselves, or heard, as in the typing study, where the prosody came from outside. Both of these suggest that these are mediated by speech-based representations. And the contribution of speech manner and sentence structure and emotion to the predictions of motor movements in the hands suggests that prosody is part of this internal representation and constitutes an important part of the bridge across the mind-flesh gap. Thank you.